A quiet celebratory dinner turns into a nightmare when a zealous rookie cop decides the sharply dressed black man at table 4 fits the profile of a violent fugitive. Handcuffs rattle. Backup is called. But the officer didn't realize the elderly white man sitting across from his suspect commanded the entire Pacific Fleet. The ambiance inside the Wellington, one of San Diego's most exclusive steakhouses, was a masterclass in understated luxury. Soft jazz floated through the dining room, blending with the low hum of affluent conversation and the clinking of heavy crystal glasses. The lighting was dim, designed to offer privacy to the politicians, tech executives, and high-ranking military officials who frequented the establishment. At table 4, tucked away in a semi-private alcove near the wine cellar, sat David Hayes. At 42, David possessed the kind of quiet, imposing posture that came from 2 decades of rigid discipline. Tonight he was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and a subtle navy tie. He was celebrating. Across the table sat Henry Pendleton, a 64-year-old man with silver hair neatly parted, eyes like chipped flint, and a modest navy blazer over an open-collared shirt. To the rest of the restaurant, they looked like 2 successful businessmen closing a lucrative deal. Only a few observant souls might have noticed the rigid way they both sat, or the way their eyes instinctively tracked the exits. David had just received news of his promotion to captain in the United States Navy, a monumental milestone. Henry, a man who had mentored David since his days as a young lieutenant, had insisted on buying the most expensive dry-aged ribeyes on the menu to commemorate the occasion. "I'm telling you, David," Henry said, his voice a gravelly baritone, taking a slow sip of a 20-year-old single malt. "When they hand you that command, the weight of the ship changes. You stop sleeping the same way. Every hum of the engine, every rattle in the bulkheads, it all belongs to you now." David smiled, slicing a piece of his steak. "I'm ready for it, though I suspect my wife is less thrilled about the deployment schedule. But she understands. She always has. She's a good woman." Henry nodded respectfully. "You make sure you take her to Hawaii before you ship out. That's an order." David chuckled. "Yes, sir." Outside the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant, the damp evening air was suddenly pierced by the wail of police sirens. They grew louder, echoing off the high rises of the gas lamp quarter, before abruptly dying out right in front of the Wellington. Neither David nor Henry paid it much mind. In a busy downtown sector, sirens were just background noise. But less than a minute later, the thick oak doors of the restaurant were shoved open with a violence that made the maitre d' jump. Officer Gabriel Miller stepped into the lobby, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his sidearm. Miller was young, tightly wound, and sweating profusely beneath his tactical vest. A radio crackled on his shoulder. 10 minutes ago, a violent armed robbery had occurred at a high-end jewelry store 3 blocks away. The suspect had shot a security guard and fled on foot. The bolo, be on the lookout description, broadcast over the dispatch was painfully generic. Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, dark clothing, armed and dangerous. Miller's eyes frantically scanned the dimly lit restaurant. He was amped on adrenaline, eager to make a career-defining collar, and his judgment was clouded by the tunnel vision of a chaotic pursuit. He shoved past the protesting manager, a dignified Frenchman named Henri. Sir, you cannot barge in here like this," Henri pleaded, chasing after the officer. "This is a private dining room." "Police business, back off," Miller barked, not even looking at the manager. Miller's frantic gaze swept past the bar, past the booths, and finally landed on the semi-private alcove. He saw David Hayes, a black man, wearing a dark charcoal suit. In Miller's adrenaline-soaked mind, the tailored suit looked like dark clothing. The confident, broad-shouldered build looked like a threat. Without a second thought, without consulting the manager or observing the context of the high-end dinner, Miller made a beeline for table 4. The jazz music seemed to fade away as the heavy thud of Miller's combat boots drew the attention of the surrounding diners. Conversations halted. Silverware paused mid-air. David noticed the officer approaching out of his peripheral vision. He didn't flinch. Decades of serving in high-stress combat zones had completely burned out his panic reflex. He simply placed his knife and fork down, chewing his food slowly, and waited. Across from him, Henry's eyes narrowed into tiny slits, locking onto the officer with the cold calculation of a predator assessing a sudden disruption in its territory. Miller stopped a mere 2 feet from David's chair. He unclasped the retention strap on his holster. "Show me your hands, right now." "Put them flat on the table," Miller commanded, his voice trembling slightly with aggressive energy. David swallowed his food, keeping his movements deliberate and slow. He rested his hands openly on the white tablecloth, palms down. His face was completely neutral. "Is there a problem, officer?" David asked. His voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. "I said keep your hands flat," Miller snapped, though David was already complying perfectly. "Stand up slowly and turn around." "Officer," David said, his tone polite but firm. "I believe you have mistaken me for someone else. I am having dinner. Do not argue with me." Miller's voice cracked, rising in volume, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Dozens of affluent patrons were now staring openly. A few reached into their purses for their cell phones. "You match the description of an armed fugitive. Stand up, turn around, and put your hands behind your back." David did not stand. He looked directly into Miller's eyes. "Officer, I have been sitting at this table for 1 hour and 45 minutes. You can verify this with the manager or check the restaurant's security footage. I am not the man you are looking for." Miller's face flushed red. He felt his authority being challenged in front of a room full of wealthy elites. The adrenaline, mixed with his bruised ego, overrode any remaining shred of common sense. He grabbed his shoulder radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have the suspect at the Wellington on 5th Avenue. He is refusing lawful orders. I need backup, code 3. The radio squawked back. "Copy, Unit 4. Backup is en route." Henry Pendleton had not moved a single muscle. He sat with his elbows resting lightly on the armrests of his chair, watching the young cop with a chilling intensity. He hadn't spoken a word. He was waiting to see exactly how far this officer was willing to take his disastrous mistake. The silence in the restaurant was deafening, broken only by the static hiss of Miller's radio. The air was thick with tension, the kind of heavy, suffocating atmosphere that precedes a violent storm. David remained seated. He knew the statistics. He knew the reality of the country he served. He knew that sudden movements, even innocent ones, could result in a bullet to the chest. He kept his hands flat on the white linen, his breathing shallow and controlled. "I'm going to ask you for your identification, officer," David said calmly, "and I am willing to provide mine. It is in my inner left breast pocket, but I am not going to stand up and allow you to handcuff me for a crime I did not commit." "I'm giving you a lawful order to stand up," Miller yelled, his hand now hovering inches above his service weapon. The sheer panic in the young cop's eyes was the most dangerous thing in the room. Inexperienced and terrified men with badges were a lethal combination. "If you reach inside that jacket, I will drop you. Do you understand me?" "I understand that you are highly agitated," David replied, his voice taking on the natural, authoritative cadence he used when dressing down unruly sailors on the deck of a destroyer. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a steel blade. "I understand that you are operating on a vague description. I am telling you firmly and respectfully to take a breath and investigate before you do something you can't undo." The manager, Henry, finally broke through the paralysis that had gripped the staff. He rushed forward, holding a tablet. "Officer, please, Mr. Hayes has been here since 7 o'clock. I seated him myself. "The kitchen has the timestamps on his courses." "Shut up and step back," Miller screamed, shoving his hand out and catching Henri in the chest, pushing the older manager into a nearby serving cart. The cart rattled, sending a stack of side plates crashing to the hardwood floor. The sharp sound of breaking porcelain made several diners gasp and recoil. Miller pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt with his left hand, while keeping his right hand near his gun. He stepped aggressively into David's personal space. "You're under arrest for resisting and obstruction," Miller snarled, spit flying from his lips. He reached down and grabbed David roughly by the shoulder of his tailored suit, attempting to yank the larger man out of his chair. David's body went rigid, his core engaged, rooting him to the heavy wooden chair. Miller tugged, but it was like trying to uproot a deeply planted oak tree. David didn't strike back. He didn't raise his hands. He simply refused to be moved. "Let go of me," David said. The politeness was gone. The voice was now a deep, rumbling warning. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Miller shouted, trying to manufacture a struggle that wasn't happening to justify the force he was about to use. He raised his radio. "Suspect is fighting! I need units now!" Miller pulled his baton from his belt, raising it above his head, ready to strike David across the collarbone to force compliance. The gasps in the restaurant turned to screams. People ducked under their tables. It was at this exact fraction of a second that Henry Pendleton finally moved. He didn't leap up. He didn't shout. He simply picked up his heavy crystal tumbler and brought it down hard on the wooden edge of the table. Crack! The sound was sharp as a gunshot. It froze Miller mid-swing. Henry slowly stood up from his chair. He was not a massive man, but the sheer, crushing weight of his presence suddenly filled the entire alcove. Decades of sending men to war, of standing in the war room of the Pentagon, of commanding aircraft carriers that carried enough firepower to level small nations. It all radiated from his posture. Henry looked at Miller, his blue eyes cold and utterly merciless. "Take your hand off my captain, son," Henry said softly. The quietness of the command was infinitely more terrifying than Miller's screaming. Miller blinked, his baton still raised. He looked at the elderly white man in the navy blazer. "Sit down, old man. Interfere with a police investigation, and you're going to jail too." Henry took one slow, deliberate step forward. He completely ignored the threat, moving directly into the path of Miller's raised baton. "You walked into this establishment," Henry began, his voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent dining room, ignored the civilian staff, assaulted the manager, and attempted to unlawfully detain a decorated United States naval officer based on a description so broad it could apply to a quarter of the men in this city. Henry took another step. He was now inches from Miller. The sheer proximity forced the young cop to step back, lowering his baton a fraction of an inch. "You're shaking, officer," Henry noted, staring directly into Miller's panicked eyes. "Your finger is twitching near your holster. You are terrified, completely out of your depth, and you are currently assaulting an officer who holds top-secret security clearance on the night I am celebrating his promotion." He matches the BOLO, Miller stammered, his bravado suddenly cracking against the unbreakable wall of Henry's authority. "The BOLO?" Henry's voice was laced with lethal contempt. I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket. I'm going to pull out my credentials. If you so much as twitch toward your weapon, I promise you, the ensuing fallout will scrub your name from the registry of the living." Henry didn't wait for permission. He casually reached into his breast pocket and produced a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open and tossed it onto the white tablecloth, right next to David's half-eaten steak. The gold badge gleamed under the dim lights, but it was the military identification card that caught the light. 4 silver stars. "My name is Admiral Henry Pendleton, Commander, United States Pacific Fleet," Henry said, the title dropping like a physical weight onto the officer's shoulders. "And this is Captain David Hayes. Now, unless your armed robber was wearing a custom-tailored suit and has an alibi corroborated by the commander of the Pacific Fleet, I suggest you take your hands off him, holster your weapon, and call your watch commander." Right now, the 4 silver stars, sitting on the pristine white tablecloth, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Officer Gabriel Miller stared at the military identification card, his mind violently struggling to process the catastrophic error he had just made. The adrenaline that had propelled him into the restaurant was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing dread. Before Miller could formulate a response, the heavy mahogany doors of the Wellington burst open once again. The cavalry had arrived. 4 heavily armed police officers poured into the restaurant lobby, their service weapons drawn, sweeping the room with tactical precision. Following close behind them was Lieutenant Gregory Harrison, a 20-year veteran of the San Diego Police Department and the night's watch commander. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick grey mustache and a permanent scowl, seasoned by decades of street work. "Miller, where is he?" one of the backup officers shouted, spotting his colleague standing near the semi-private alcove. Seeing the drawn weapons, panic rippled through the dining room once more. Patrons dove beneath their tables, crying out in fear. The arriving officers locked their sights on the alcove, their weapons instinctively raising toward the only black man in the vicinity. David Hayes. "Drop the weapons!" one of the officers screamed at David, completely misreading the scene. "Get on the ground!" David remained perfectly still, his hands still flat on the table, his face a mask of iron discipline. He had stared down hostile fire in foreign waters. He was not going to be intimidated by frantic local police. But Admiral Henry Pendleton was not about to let his captain be held at gunpoint. Moving with an agility that belied his 64 years, Henry stepped directly into the line of fire, physically placing his own body between the loaded weapons and David. He stood tall, his chest out, a living shield of unyielding authority. "Lower your weapons immediately," Henry roared. The gravelly baritone of his voice was gone, replaced by the deafening, authoritative boom of a fleet commander giving an order in a war zone. It was a voice that commanded thousands of sailors and dictated the movements of nuclear submarines. It echoed through the restaurant, vibrating in the chests of everyone present. "Lower them now, or by God, I will see every single one of you brought up on federal charges." Lieutenant Harrison pushed his way to the front of his men, his eyes darting frantically to assess the situation. He saw Miller, pale as a ghost, staring at the table. He saw the elegantly dressed black man sitting calmly. And he saw the silver-haired older man shielding him, radiating a terrifying level of fury. Harrison's eyes dropped to the table. He saw the gold badge and the military ID card. 4 stars. The color drained from the watch commander's face. He knew exactly what that meant. In a military town like San Diego, a 4-star admiral was practically royalty. They possessed a level of power and influence that dwarfed the local city government. "Holster your weapons! Stand down! Stand down right now!" Harrison bellowed at his officers. physically slapping the barrel of one officer's gun toward the floor. The backup officers, bewildered but trained to obey their commander, reluctantly holstered their firearms. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating. Harrison took off his uniform hat, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, and approached the table slowly, as if walking through a minefield. "Admiral Pendleton," Harrison said, his voice completely devoid of the usual police bravado, replacing it with deep, deferential respect. "I am Lieutenant Harrison. I am the watch commander. Sir, I need to understand what happened here." Henry didn't move an inch. "What happened here, Lieutenant, is that your rookie officer bypassed the restaurant staff, ignored the manager, and attempted to violently and unlawfully arrest my colleague, Captain David Hayes of the United States Navy." Henry pointed a rigid finger at Miller, who was now visibly shaking. "He did this based on a vague, racially motivated assumption, completely ignoring the fact that Captain Hayes has been sitting at this table for nearly 2 hours. Your officer threatened deadly force against a decorated military officer without a shred of competent investigation." Harrison turned slowly to look at Miller. The look of utter disgust on the lieutenant's face was palpable. Suddenly, the radio clipped to Harrison's shoulder crackled to life, echoing loudly in the quiet restaurant. "Dispatch to all units. Update on the jewelry store 211. Suspect is in custody at 4th and Broadway. Repeat, suspect is in custody. Recovered a red hoodie, denim jeans, and the stolen merchandise. Stand down the perimeter." The dispatch broadcast was the final, devastating nail in the coffin. The actual suspect had been wearing a red hoodie and jeans. He was caught blocks away. David finally broke his silence. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He smoothed the front of his tailored charcoal suit. He towered over Officer Miller, looking down at the young man with a gaze of profound disappointment rather than anger. "A red hoodie and jeans, officer," David said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I am wearing a custom-made Italian wool suit. Do they look similar to you? Or did you stop looking the second you saw the color of my skin?" Miller opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked to his lieutenant for help, but Harrison had already turned his back on him. "Officer Miller, hand me your badge and your service weapon," Harrison ordered, his voice cold and clinical. "Sir," Miller whispered, his eyes wide with shock, "you are stripped of your police powers, effective immediately, pending a full internal affairs investigation," Harrison stated loudly, ensuring the entire restaurant could hear the accountability being enforced. "Hand them over. Now." Miller, his hands trembling violently, unclipped his radio, unbuckled his duty belt, and handed over his badge. His career, his reputation, and his freedom were disintegrating right before his eyes. The aftermath of the incident at the Wellington was swift, brutal, and highly publicized. Despite the police department's desperate attempts to keep the altercation quiet, in an era of smartphones, secrecy was an illusion. Several affluent diners had recorded the entire exchange, from Miller's aggressive entrance to Admiral Pendleton's legendary stand, and finally, Miller being stripped of his badge. The video hit the local news networks by morning and went viral globally by noon. The San Diego Police Department found itself facing a monumental public relations nightmare. Chief of Police Richard Kowalski, a pragmatic man who despised bad press, personally drove to the San Diego Naval Base the following morning to formally apologize. He was escorted into a sterile, brightly lit conference room at the Pacific Fleet headquarters. Waiting for him were Admiral Pendleton, wearing his pristine service dress blue uniform, adorned with rows of colorful ribbons, and Captain David Hayes, equally decorated and impossibly imposing. "Admiral, Captain," Chief Kowalski began, standing rigidly at the end of the long conference table. I am here on behalf of the mayor and the entire San Diego Police Department to offer our deepest, most sincere apologies for the abhorrent behavior of Gabriel Miller. Sit down, Chief, Henry commanded, pointing to a chair. It was not a request. Kowalski sat. Miller's actions do not reflect the training or the values of our department. He bypassed protocol, he ignored dispatch updates, and he acted on a dangerous bias. He has been formally terminated, and the district attorney is currently reviewing the footage to file charges for aggravated assault under the color of authority. Henry looked at David, giving a slight nod, yielding the floor to the man who had been the target of the assault. David leaned forward, resting his powerful hands on the polished oak table. "Chief Kowalski," David said, his voice perfectly measured. "I appreciate the swift termination of Mr. Miller, but let us be absolutely clear about why we are having this meeting. We are not having this meeting because your system worked. We are having this meeting because I happen to be a naval captain, and because the commander of the Pacific Fleet was sitting across from me." David paused, letting the heavy truth of his words sink into the room. "If I were an ordinary citizen," David continued, his eyes locked onto the chief's. "If I were a civilian, a teacher, a construction worker, or a college student, how would that encounter have ended? If Admiral Pendleton had not been there to stop that baton from striking me, what narrative would your department have spun today? Would I be sitting in a holding cell right now, nursing a broken collarbone, charged with resisting arrest? Or worse?" Chief Kowalski swallowed hard. He had no defense against the truth. "Captain, you make a fair point. We have systemic issues. We are working on them." "Work harder," David replied, his tone sharp and unyielding. "Because the uniform I wear demands that I protect the citizens of this country. All of them. The uniform your officers wear demands the exact same thing. When a man with a badge allows his prejudice to override his training, he doesn't just betray the public trust. He makes every single good officer on the street a target. He makes the uniform a symbol of fear rather than a symbol of safety." David stood up, signaling that the meeting was nearing its end. "I am not pressing personal civil charges against the city, Chief," David stated. "Not because I don't have a case, but because the taxpayers shouldn't have to foot the bill for your department's failures. However, I expect a public statement from your office, acknowledging the racial profiling, acknowledging the failure of training. No excuses, no blue wall of silence, just the truth." "You will have it, Captain," Kowalski promised, standing up to meet David's eye level. "You have my word." Later that evening, the sun dipped low over the Pacific Ocean, casting long golden shadows across the deck of the USS Arleigh Burke. David stood at the railing, looking out at the endless expanse of water. Tomorrow he would formally take command of the destroyer. He would be responsible for the lives of over 300 sailors. Henry walked up silently beside him, the ocean breeze ruffling his silver hair. "You handled the chief well today, David," Henry said quietly, looking out at the horizon. "I just told him the truth, sir," David replied. "It's easy to be brave when you have 4 stars covering your 6. Henry chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "You didn't need my stars, son. You had him beat the second you refused to let him take your dignity. I just provided the punctuation." David smiled faintly. The trauma of the previous night lingered, a dark reminder of the realities of the world he lived in. But looking at the massive grey warship around him and the mentor standing beside him, he felt a profound sense of purpose. "You ready for tomorrow, Captain?" Henry asked, turning to face him. David straightened his posture, the weight of the previous night's indignity washing away, replaced by the heavy, honourable mantle of command. "I have the watch, Admiral," David said. "I'm ready." What an incredible story of composure, unyielding authority, and the absolute demand for accountability. Captain David Hayes proved that true strength doesn't require raising your fists, and Admiral Pendleton showed us what it means to fiercely protect your own against injustice. If this real-life drama